Thank you for joining me on a quilting tale today. My name is Shaylin, and in this video, I'm going to share my first finished quilt top of 2026, and that is the Knitted Blooms quilt, which is a pattern by Lo Behold Stitchery. I'm making the twin size, which involves 20 of these gorgeous blocks. They're 19.5-inch square blocks. And I have a couple other videos where I've mentioned working on this quilt. I will make a playlist and attach it at the end of the video and link it in the description so you can see all three videos in one place if you're interested in making this quilt or a quilt that's similar with lots of strip pieces. I know Lo Behold has a knitted stars quilt pattern that I think these tips would also be very helpful with. To give you a quick idea of the other two videos, the first one mentioned a few quilts I was working on, and there's a segment that focuses on the inspiration behind the colors I chose for this quilt, and that happens to be this t-shirt that I'm wearing. It's a shirt I got from Custer State Park in South Dakota a couple summers ago, and I just love the retro feel of this t-shirt and wanted to replicate it in a quilt. I also did some initial cutting and organizing in that video. The second video focuses exclusively on Knitted Blooms, where I follow some of the tips Brittany, the pattern creator and owner of Lo Behold Stitchery, had shared. And so I was trying those tips out and just sharing some other initial things that I found helpful as I was making this. I also wanted to make this block a little more unique by adding a doily to the center, and I'll have to show that up close most likely. Some colors, the doily stands out a lot more than others, but I added the doily to see if I liked that little vintage touch, and I did, so I carried it through to all 20 of the blocks. In this video, now that I'm almost finished, I have a few more tips that have really helped for getting a nice square block and making sure that it's not wrinkled and just being more accurate in my piecing. So this is just some final tips and another organizational piece to help if you're interested in making this quilt. Now you may have seen over the summer I was doing a wheel of whips, and this was one of the quilts on it. And it was my final spin of the summer. It was the quilt I wanted to be my fall finish. Obviously, it didn't get finished in the fall, but like I've done with past videos, I like to incorporate just some of the scenery from the lovely Pacific Northwest where I live. And so I had gathered footage for that I had meant to share if I had finished this in the fall. And even though we're in the heart of winter, I'm still going to share it because it's just beautiful here. And I think it's just nice to take some little intermissions and see something lovely. So I'll sprinkle that in throughout the video as well. So I hope you enjoy seeing that footage and watching the rest of this quilt come together. Let's get started. To help flatten my blocks once they are finished, I put them under my heaviest rulers, or sometimes I use heavy books on top of them. But when I put my first ruler down, I'm careful to make sure that I'm pushing the fabric outward so that it's really flattening and not flattening creases into it. So at least overnight, I want to work on flattening the block. Now, as you can see, the edges are not straight. They need to be trimmed down. And with a block this size, I don't have a ruler that's large enough to trim. So what I'm going to do is line up my left edge of one, and it's a square block, so it doesn't matter which. But I'm going to just line up so that the edges that are the most inside are at least on my 0 line of my ruler. And then I'm going to make sure that on this side, I need 19.5 inches at least. This is a 19.5 inch block. So I just want to make sure that all the edges on this side are at 19.5, which that looks good. And then I'm just going to rely on my vertical seam lines to make sure that nothing is going crooked. I just want to make sure that they look like they're running parallel to the lines up above. And so I think that looks good. I'm going to make my first cut. And then after you make one cut, you can start squaring up from that clean edge. So I'm just lining up this ruler on the 19.5 mark. And I can use my horizontal seam lines on my block to try to line up to a horizontal line on my ruler. And that's another way I can just make sure that I'm not cutting it crookedly. So I'm going to go ahead and make my first cut. So you can see some parts had bigger pieces coming off, some hardly had any. But now I can take that side and rotate it so that cut edge is now on my 0 line. And now I want to again trim at the 19.5 mark. I'm just looking at some of these vertical seams and seeing that they look like they're running parallel with the vertical seams on my ruler. And then I'm going to slide this over to 19.5. Use the horizontal lines to line up with the dots on my ruler. And I'll make another cut. Okay, so now I'm going to flip to do one of my sides, and it should get easier with each cut because now I have the top and bottom. I can align them with a horizontal line on my ruler. And again, I'm going to pull a side over so that even the most inner pieces are at least on the 0 line. Double check that this side is all at least overlapping the 19.5 mark. I'll make that cut. And you should see that the edges that you've cut are lined up with ruler marks now. And one final flip. So now I'm going to line one straight edge with the bottom horizontal line. I actually put it on the 1-inch mark. And then the side is lined up with 0. I'm going to go over to 19.5. That's lined up on 19.5. Just, I can move my ruler up or down to make sure that my horizontal lines on the ruler are lining up. And I've got a squared up block now. I'm going to share some final tips that have helped when putting these blocks together. So these are all the pieces for the next block, and I'm just going to set these ones aside because those will come closer to the end. But one tip I have for assembling the little strips onto the small flower unit is to always orient the small flower unit in one place. For me, it's going to be the upper right because that's the way it's shown in the pattern. So when you are attaching your first piece, you're going to be attaching to the left side of the flower unit, all the odd pieces, and then you'll attach the even pieces to the bottom of the unit. And so if you get mixed up, you can count and see, well, how many are to the left or how many are on the bottom, and that can help you keep track of which piece you're doing next. So just keep it oriented in one spot that you remember, because once you start attaching pieces, they can kind of blend together and it might get a little confusing which piece you just put on, because it starts to look like, is this the bottom of this piece or is it the side of this piece? So keep it oriented in one spot. The other tip I have is to use pins, because you have little seams like this one here. I'll want to align to this seam here. And because the seams are pressed open, they don't nest as easily. So I always just look at where that seam is and line it up as best I can. You might feel it lock in place just a little, and if you are really accurate with your cutting and piecing, the side edges should line up. But I would just put pins. I've been using about 3 or 4 to hold it in place rather than just hope that they line up. So use pins. And as it grows longer and wider, I will pin more than this. But then when you sew, just backstitch the beginning, sew down a 1/4 inch, backstitch the end, and then you'll end up pressing open. Don't forget to reduce your stitch size. I've been using 1.8 for my stitch size. I want to share some tips for pressing these open and trying to keep some of the ripples out of the strips once the whole block is put together. So I've made several of these at this point, and you'll notice even in the block that I square up in this video, there are some ripples in the strips after they're pressed open. And so I'm not too concerned with them. They're not huge. And I know once everything is quilted and washed, a lot of the long arming will take care of that. But to just prevent some of that, something that I have found that helps is to first, before I press these open, I'm just going to relax the threads by just heating them up with the iron. And then when I open them, instead of just immediately pressing, I'm going to kind of finger press them open and even tug a little bit. Not really hard, we don't want to warp anything, but just really make sure that the seam is open. And if we do that every time, and then when the iron's down, sometimes I even tug on the other side, that just helps ensure that it really is flat. And then I'm using a product called Flatter that Brittany from Lo Behold Stitchery suggested using. It's not necessary, but it does help your seams to lie flatter. So I'm just going to give those a press, and then I like to press at the top. But there's just no ripples in there right now, and you'll start to notice them perhaps as you attach more pieces. So my goal is to just get the seams as flat as can be with each stage of the pressing and sewing process. That way, when I'm attaching other pieces, it's already on a flat unit, and so the odds of it rippling are going to go down. I also use a clapper to help flatten the blocks as much as possible. So there's a few things you can use, but I really think it's making sure that these seams are open completely and that there's no bunching of the strips, because even a little bit as you add more pieces can add up. So another tip I have before attaching the second piece, again, I'm keeping my small flower unit in the upper right corner, is just to look and see if there's any bowing of the strip. It's good to take care of that before you start attaching more pieces. So I line up my ruler to my seam lines and then slice off any extra. Now that is a really insignificant amount, I would say, but you might notice when you do others that there is a clear bowing taking place. And so just straightening them just increases your chances of not having that curving effect happening that's going to give you ripples later on when you press it straight. So that one had a little more. So you could do this with each step, or even after you've attached one side piece and one bottom piece. But I would just check in with it frequently before you attach too many of the strips. Now I do like to check before I press my seams open that the seams align nicely, especially where there's contrasting fabrics. And these ones all look good. This last one, there's a little bit of overlap there. And normally that much wouldn't bother me, but I just want to demonstrate if you do have seams that are off, you can take a few stitches out. And I usually go maybe about a 1/2 inch above and a 1/2 inch below where the overlap is happening. Or maybe they're too far apart and you need to move them closer together. But wherever that is, just a little above and a little below. And unfortunately, the smaller the stitch size you use, the harder it is to get them out. But I usually get a few started and then kind of pull it apart. You could get your seam ripper in there once you start it. You just want to be careful not to tear holes in your fabric. So sometimes that works, just working with the hole that you've opened. But whatever works for you, just be careful with the fabric. Okay, so that's probably good right there. So I'm going to just remove all the extra threads, especially on the inside, because sometimes you have some sticking out there and then they are visible when you sew it back together. So just try to take any of those out from the inside. But I'm just going to realign and pin it carefully in place. And it should have, like I have that little gap right there. It's nothing significant. As it goes through the feed dogs, it'll flatten out, but that should make a difference. It's not just lining it up exactly where it was before. So this time I'm going to put it back under. I'm going to start a little above, so at my stitches end right here. So I'll put the needle above, back stitch, follow the line down 1/4 inch. When I get to this part, I'm going to go over just a little bit, back stitch, and then end here. And so that will secure the threads in place. So you can see here where I back stitched at the beginning and end. And then when we open it up, now it's all aligned nicely. So I didn't have to take the whole thing out. You just need to give yourself enough space to scoot it up or down. At this point, you can see how it can be hard to tell if that little dark square here is a piece of this strip or a piece of this strip. And so that's why keeping the orientation of the small flower unit is important. That keeps you from getting mixed up. So I know that I'm keeping mine in the upper right corner as I build this quadrant. And so my odd number strips are going to go to the left, and below the small flower unit will be my even strips. So I'm on strip number 3, so I know it's going to go here. My 4 quadrants are finished, and just like I did with each strip I attached, I'm going to make sure that they are all squared up. So I'm going to take the last piece that I attached, and just cut off any excess that might be bowing out. So just lining the ruler lines up with the seam. And this cut is important because it's the one that's going to be attaching to the sashing pieces. When it's time to do the center piece for the doily, I'm just going to put a little dab of glue in the middle, out of the way of stitching, and try to center that flower right in the middle. And then here's something that I have found has helped when it's time to sew the 2 pieces together. I'm going to turn this over, and there's some overhang from the doily, but I want to make sure that the colored squares are what are lined up. And I just put a pin toward the bottom to hold it in place. And then when I sew, instead of starting at the top, even with a leader, sometimes my machine kind of chews up this beginning portion. I don't know if it's just because the doily isn't as solid or it's just too much trying to go through at once. So what I do is start with the needle about right here. I don't even back stitch. I just start sewing down 1/4 inch, and then I do back stitch at the bottom. And then what I'll do is flip it over, and I want to make sure my pieces are aligned when I'm sending it under the needle. But I'm going to go to where I started, which would be right about here, and I'll back stitch here and then sew down the end and back stitch again. So that way it's secure and in there, but it's not bunching at the start of the sewing. When it comes time to press with the doily, I still press open, and I just kind of follow whichever side it seems to want to rest. So same thing, I just give it a little tug to the side to really flatten the seam. A little bit of flatter. And then I'm going to go ahead and just trim the excess doily off the side that's been sewn. And you could do it before you press it too. But I'm just going to trim now that it's secure in the seam allowance. And then once I sew it to the top and bottom portion, I will trim the top and bottom so that it's just flush with the blue square in the center. So I'm going to go ahead now and finish assembling my quadrants. So I'll do a top and bottom like this. So I'll have two like this. And then another one will be attached on this side. So you just want to make sure that your center pieces, just like your little small flower units, are forming in the middle. So when I pin longer strips like this, I start first by pinning any seams. So this seam to this seam to align. And then I pin the ends, not quite at the end where I'm going to start sewing, but very close. And then that allows any fabric, if it's too long or too short, to just kind of be eased in. So I just put some middle pins in there too. But my pieces have been coming out pretty accurately where I haven't had to ease any in. But just another tip to line your ends up and then work your way to the middle. All right, I did my final seam. So before I press the seams open, I'm just going to cut off the excess doily that's hanging out over the edge. I'll go ahead and give my seams an initial press. And then press open. So with a block this big, I'm going to have to maneuver it around a bit, but I still want to kind of tug it firmly both ways. This little project iron is nice because I can watch the neighboring seams a little better so I don't accidentally flip them in a different direction. And then when I get to the seam with the doily, just going to make sure I pull it all down. Maybe give it a little bit of a longer press because it is a bit bulkier there. Use my elbow to hold it down and pull it the opposite direction. And now that I've done a dry iron, spray it and go over it one more time. Just giving it a little bit of a tug downward. go, and then we'll turn it over. Oh, beautiful. It's got a few loose threads. I'll trim that one. It wants to hold on there. Let me just give it one final press from the front. And then I'm going to just put the clappers on it for a few moments. And we can take a look and see if the rippling is any better. I'll lay it flat in just a moment. So this block has been flattened overnight and it has been trimmed down. And you'll notice there is some rippling in the strips. And so this particular block, I was not as consistent with really making sure the seams were pressed open each time and trimming to make sure there was no bowing in each strip. And so let's compare that to the one I just finished, which has not been trimmed yet. It has not been flattened, but it hardly looks like it needs a trimming, and you don't see the ripples in it. And so it hasn't, like I said, been sitting under my rulers or heavy books, but it already looks really good. So just that extra attention to detail, making sure the seams are really pressed open and that you're trimming as you go, makes a big difference. And so I just wanted to show that difference. Now, one last tip before I finish these blocks up and put the top together. I've been using these stickers to correspond to the rows, which are the numbers, and the letters are the columns. And these correspond to a photo that I took before the blocks were assembled. I just had set them all out in what I thought would disperse the colors well, because I knew that when they were large, I wouldn't have as much room to lay them out. And so I took that photograph, and that way, if I ever accidentally put one in a different spot, I know that they're marked and where it belongs, or I could refer to the photo to find out. But this will allow me, when it is time to lay them all out, I'll probably have to do it on the floor somewhere. If I try to make adjustments and don't like those adjustments, I can see where I had originally planned to put them, because sometimes rearranging the blocks takes quite a bit of time. But I'm going to go ahead and get this under some rulers and let it sit. I have 4 more blocks to make, and then I'll be ready to put the top together. I am down to my final 2 blocks, which is very exciting, but it just dawned on me that I didn't share how I store all the pieces to this quilt for when I want to work on something else or just need it out of the way. And so I thought I would do that before this tub is completely emptied. So inside, I keep my labels to label the row and column that each block will be in. And then I've been stacking the pieces to each block with the small flower units on the bottom, because they just make a nice base to hold the smaller pieces here. So all my strips, and then I keep the cross pieces clipped together. And so I stack them by row and the order that I'm going to sew them from left to right in the rows. And so as you can see, I just have 2 left, but there's 4 blocks in each row. So I'd have my stack of 4 and a slip of paper that said row 5. And then I'd have the next set of 4 on top and a slip of paper that said row 4. And then there's room on this side as well. So I would keep them ready to just pull out and make when I have time. And then also in this tote, kept the doilies in a little bag so they don't float away and get lost. I'll talk about this one in a moment. I kept the strips that each block needs, the little sashing strips, off to the side. And then I love the little Ziploc bags that Fat Quarter Shop sends fabric, and I just keep these. I got all these fabrics from my local quilt shop, but it's nice to just keep the extra fabric left over after cutting all the pieces. I don't put these in my stash immediately. I wait until the quilt is done, just in case I realized, oh, I didn't cut enough pieces, or I made a mistake, or something happens to a piece. I can get more, and I have every color still available in there. So when the quilt is completely done, I'll empty this and put it in my stash. And then I just have the parts of the pattern I'm done with and coloring pages. It just all stays together in one place. This is going to be my backing fabric, and this was a happy accident. Fortunately, I make a lot of large throw size quilts, because this was intended for a different quilt I'm making. And online, it looked more pink to me, and I thought this might be burgundy, and that's what I was hoping for. But when I saw it, I thought, oh, that's kind of more brown, and it's more of a purpley pink, which did not work with the fabrics that I had already had pulled aside for this other quilt. But I looked at it with the knitted blooms fabric I have, and this happens to be a pinkish purple that I don't typically use, but it looks beautiful with this. Plus it has the yellow and the cream, which I'm using in the quilt. So it's also a large throw size, so I have enough fabric here to do the backing of this quilt. So like I said, a happy accident. I love when it turns out that way, and I'm not stuck with a color palette that I just don't have a purpose for, or I have to come up with something for it. So that worked out really well. But now I'm going to finish the final 2 blocks, and then I will come back and show you how I assemble the rows. right, all 20 of my blocks are finished, and I have them up on the design wall, which isn't quite big enough, so I had to overlap them a bit. The block in the bottom right corner is done, but it's currently under some rulers, getting as much time to flatten as possible. This is not the initial layout that I had planned as far as color disbursement. When I set them up according to the labels I had placed on them and my initial pictures, I thought it looked really nice, but when I took that black and white photo of it, I saw that the yellow and cream blocks had the lowest value and showed up almost white in the black and white photo, and then the others were more of a medium tone. And so just to put more contrast and interest, I wanted to disperse the yellows and creams a little more, and that will give this a little more balance. That block that's missing is a bright orange, which is a little lighter than the blue and purple that will surround it. So I think that will still look just fine. When I was considering color placement for this quilt, I was mostly focused on the placement of the main color in each quadrant rather than these small flower units, little crosses, or the center of them, because there's just so many color combinations that to try to avoid getting like colors in the crosses or a like color with the next block's main print would just get overwhelming and kind of hurt my head, and just never will get to the end of rearranging. So the main part of the block's color was my greatest consideration. The small flower units are so small and scattered that I don't think it has nearly the impact as spreading around the main portion of the blocks. But now that I have all the blocks in the position that I want them to be in, a few tips for piecing. If you come up close, you'll see that there will still be some seams to match up, but the nice thing is it's all background fabric. So if they're not lined up exactly, it's going to be a lot less noticeable than if you don't line up the contrasting fabrics. So this should go by pretty quickly. I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch as I connect each of these blocks, back stitching at the beginning and end of each block. And then same thing when I do the rows, I'll back stitch the beginning and end of those. Now what I like to do with large quilts is try to assemble half of it, the top and the bottom. Now with 5 rows, I can't do that exactly. So what I'll probably do is connect rows 1, 2, and 3 as one large piece. And then I'll connect rows 4 and 5. And then once those are done, I'll connect those 2 pieces. That just saves me from having more bulk under the machine and more weight to contend with. I won't have to do that as much. So that would be a tip for any large quilt, is just try to make the top half and the bottom and then piece them together. After I've sewn each row together, I've been pressing the seams open like so. And I just thought it was worth pointing out that the most important seams to align are going to be the middle sashing strip and then where the crosses meet. So their seams should be lined up. That's where you want to pin for sure. The rest will kind of just fall into place or can be eased in. I would be more concerned about making sure that the crosses align than the top and bottom of the blocks, because if one is higher or lower, it's going to be more noticeable. And if you have uneven blocks, you can trim them, and I can demonstrate that in a moment. So this one connected just nicely. All the seams look great. But if I go to this side, you can see that this block overhangs a little more. So the seams are lined up here, but there is some overhang. So I'm going to come on the other side so I can show you how I take care of that. So even though I squared up my blocks, because it's fabric and you're just shifting it and just making sure those seams fall into place. It's still possible to get some overhang. So what I do is I line up the edge of a long ruler with the shorter edge, and then I want it to hit where the overhang begins. And then I'm just going to run my ruler so that it lines up with the straight edge of this block. So a little bit is going to come off. It's aligned right here. This piece is going to come off and it fades back into the straight edge of the other block because it was squared up. So I can cut that piece off. And it's just a little bit that came off. And now I've got a straight edge. Another thing you might consider when you're squaring up the individual blocks is if you have quite a bit of overhang when you're trimming down to 19.5 inches, is find the center point of the block and divide the block size in half and just make sure that you have that half amount on each side of the center point, and then trim from there instead of over trimming one side, because that can throw your block off also. Here is my finished Knitted Blooms twin size quilt top. I am so pleased with how it turned out. It is so vibrant and just joyful. I love these colors together. And I think it's going to remind me of that South Dakota trip that was so special to my family. This quilt finishes at 76 by 95 inches. And now that I've finished piecing it, I wanted to share a few final tips that might make it easier to piece if you want to take this quilt on or a similar style pattern. First, if you notice, I have some clips on the left-hand side of each row. I put them in rainbow order, so red, orange, yellow, green, and blue, one for each row. And that's because as I was sewing the blocks together and their right sides together, my little stickers were starting to come off. And so I used them to mark the left side of the row. So I knew that those clips should all stay aligned when I put them together. I didn't want to accidentally flip a row or sew a block to the wrong side of another block. And so that helped me stay organized. Another consideration, if you're going to use a dark background fabric like I have with the navy, is to consider your thread choice for piecing. I don't think I necessarily needed to use a navy thread because that could show up on the colored pieces. But in some parts, I'm going to zoom in here, you can see a bit of the white thread peeking through. And that's going to lead to another tip in a moment, ways to avoid that. But I think a more neutral, like a gray color would probably have been a little more hidden. But when you back out and you're looking at the quilt in its entirety, you're not going to notice it. And once it's quilted and washed, it's going to become even harder to find those spots. What was causing those is a great reminder of backstitching the beginning and end of every seam you sew if you're going to have open seams, if you're going to press them open, because as you handle them, if they're not backstitched, they will start to come unraveled. And some of them, the unraveling was more than 1/4 inch. And so I had to go back and sew those spots. And so the white you're seeing is the first attempt, that loose thread that came unraveled. And then I would sew over it and backstitch. And so I should have just removed the thread and done it over, but I just didn't feel like it. So I do have a few spots where I wasn't backstitching, either I forgot or it was just towards the beginning before it became a habit. So some of these blocks did not have the backstitching, and it was apparent when I was piecing them that that is a great thing to do. If you're curious, I ended up using 2 full bottles of the flatter spray on a quilt this size. That was a product recommended by Brittany to help keep your seams flatter, along with using a tailor's clapper, a wool pressing mat. Those were all things that helped to get really flat seams, and it worked wonderfully. This is a very flat quilt top, even with those doilies that have been added. They are not very thick seams that you feel. My final tip, especially when you're sewing the rows together, is just keep an eye on that bobbin. Check the bobbin. I had got to the end of that final seam and noticed that the bobbin was empty about 2/3 of the way through. And so, as you can see, every seam I had pinned, and it just had to all be repinned. There are a lot of seams to match when you do this quilt, so keep an eye on that bobbin. Also, partway through a large project like this, I did clean my machine, change the needle, and you could really feel the difference once that had been done. And so I would just remind you to keep those things fresh, change your rotary cutter blade. All those things when you're doing a big project do make a difference. So by the time you see this video, this quilt top will be at the long armor. As far as my plan for having it long armed, I'm thinking some kind of floral edge to edge design that is rows, so not a meander all over, but uniform rows. I think would look good with these rows of blooms. And so I'll see what we can find. And as far as thread color, I know matching it to the background is going to be way too stark and dark on some of these. So I'll have to hold some threads to the background, but I'm thinking probably one of the blues or teal colors might work nicely. But really, I just need to see how well it blends in. Does it stand out or recede into the top? I just think I want something that kind of recedes into it. So that's what I'm going to be looking for. And so you'll have to watch in a future video to see how it was quilted. And I need to pick a binding still. You saw the backing. So I'm so pleased with this, like I said, and can't wait to get it quilted and finished. And I'm even more excited that it was my January goal, if you saw my last video, and I still have almost 2 weeks of January left at the time of filming this. And so that will allow me to get started on my February goal, which is to finish the 2025 year of sewing machines, which is it was a mystery quilt by Heather Briggs of My So Quilty Life. So I'll be working on that one next, and maybe a couple other little things. But it feels good to have a top finished so early in the year. Look forward to seeing it in a future video, all quilted and bound and ready to use. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.